June 6, 1944. Dawn crept pale and cold across the Normandy coast. Inside a reinforced bunker above Omaha Beach, Obergefreiter Hans Müller wiped condensation from his field glasses and steadied his breath. The channel looked angry, gray waves hammering the shore, the horizon blurred with mist. For 8 months this concrete fortress had been his world, yet unease coiled in his gut. A warning soldiers trust when words no longer exist. Beyond the breakers, faint shapes flickered in the haze. Müller frowned, adjusted the focus, and froze. Lines, rows of silhouettes moved across the horizon. Ships, dozens, then hundreds, creeping through fog like iron ghosts. "Scheisse," he whispered, calling for his squad leader. The Atlantic Wall, Hitler's pride of concrete and steel, was about to face its reckoning. Orders cracked over the intercom. Boots hammered concrete as gunners took their posts. Far offshore, Sergeant William Carter gripped the edge of his landing craft as waves smashed against the hull. Diesel and salt stung the air. Fear lived behind every breath. Around him, pale faces hid beneath steel helmets. Eyes fixed forward, lips whispering prayers. 10 minutes, someone shouted over the roar. Carter nodded, his stomach twisting. He had trained for months, yet nothing prepares a man to step willingly into history's fire. Inside the boat, the air grew heavy and warm with bodies and wet wool. Some men clutched photos of wives and newborns. Others stared into the mist, counting breaths. Artillery thundered from the shore, distant but relentless. The sky flashed like lightning, each burst marking another impact along the coast. "This is it," muttered a corporal. No one replied. Beneath them the sea hissed, promising death, duty, and something beyond both. On the cliffs, Müller's machine gun team scrambled into position. The bunker trembled as coastal batteries opened fire, streaks of flame cutting through fog. Through his scope, he saw landing craft lowering their ramps. Tiny figures spilled into the surf, swallowed by smoke and chaos. For a heartbeat, he froze, caught between duty and disbelief. Then instinct took over. He pressed the trigger and the morning shattered like glass. Carter's craft jolted as shells exploded nearby, geysers of seawater drenching the men. "Keep your heads down," someone shouted, his voice lost to thunder. The coastline burned ahead, smoke pouring from shattered bunkers, tracer fire slicing through the gray dawn. The ramp dropped with a metallic crash. Carter inhaled salt and fear, barely seeing the man beside him vanish as bullets tore the surf into boiling foam. The ocean turned red within minutes. Men stumbled through the freezing surf, packs dragging them down, rifles slipping from numb fingers. Bullets hissed like hornets, slicing water into mist. The air reeked of salt, oil, and blood. Carter waded forward, chest deep, heart hammering louder than the guns. Somewhere ahead, voices screamed for medics. Somewhere behind, the tide pulled the dead back to the open sea. Inside Whiterstand's Nest 72, Müller's MG-42 shrieked with mechanical fury. Its barrel glowed faintly red, the rhythm relentless, 1,200 rounds each minute. His loader cursed, swapping belts as sweat froze across his brow. Through drifting smoke, the soldiers kept coming, wave after wave of men who refused to stop. For everyone that fell, another rose. "They're endless," Brenner shouted. Müller's hands shook but never left the grip. The shore became a graveyard of steel. Burning tanks belched smoke as their crews clawed out through torn hatches. Engineers cleared mines with bare hands. Medics crawled through sand under fire, dragging the wounded behind twisted wreckage. Above it all, the sky thundered as Allied guns from the sea pounded the cliffs. Each blast lifted the earth itself, turning the beach into a living storm of fire. On the ridge, Müller wiped fog from his lenses. Through drifting smoke, he saw the unthinkable. American troops breaching the wire, crawling among the dead for cover. "They're through!" someone shouted from below. Smoke masked everything but flashes of muzzle fire. Müller squeezed the trigger again, but deep inside he knew the truth. The Atlantic Wall was breaking and no fortress could hold forever. By mid-morning, the beach was a storm of debris and smoke. Carter crawled behind a steel barrier, the sand exploding around him like shattered glass. Grit and cordite filled his mouth. An explosion hurled him sideways, deafening him with a single endless ring. Through the haze, he saw an officer waving men forward. Somehow, against the impossible, they advanced. One crawl, one breath, one heartbeat at a time. Inside the bunker, Müller's ammunition ran low. The gun clicked empty, echoing like a death knell through concrete halls. He searched for another belt, but there was none. For the first time since the war began, silence filled his nest. Then came the sound he feared most, the clank of boots on steel. The enemy was inside the perimeter now. Müller looked at Brenner, and both men understood what followed. Outside, Carter's squad reached the base of the bluff. They pressed against the sand, cliffs towering above them like stone giants. "Up!" yelled the sergeant. Grenades arced into the sky, bursting against bunkers that roared in reply. Smoke and screams fused together. Carter clawed forward, his rifle slick in his hands. Every inch gained felt stolen from death itself, the beach still burning behind them. Müller stumbled through the corridor, smoke choking the narrow halls. The walls trembled with every impact, plaster raining from the ceiling. A wounded comrade lay by the door, whispering prayers in German. Müller knelt, gripping his shoulder, but the eyes were already empty. A flash of light swallowed the room. American grenades rolled in, bouncing once, twice, then erupted, erasing sound, form, and fear alike. Carter emerged through smoke into the trench above. German weapons lay scattered among the fallen. A single MG-42 smoldered, its barrel bent from heat. The defenders were retreating toward the cliffs, some surrendering, others firing their last rounds in defiance. Carter steadied his rifle but hesitated. These men had fought with desperate courage, and now, beneath the soot and blood, most looked no older than he was. By noon, the guns began to falter. One by one, the nests fell silent, their barrels smoking in surrender. The tide crept higher, dragging wreckage and bodies back toward the gray surf. Carter crouched among the dunes, too exhausted to feel victory. Around him, medics moved like shadows, patching the living, covering the fallen. The air stank of iron and salt, the heavy scent of survival bought too dearly. Müller staggered from the shattered bunker, clutching his bleeding arm. The few defenders who survived were gathered near the cliffs, faces pale with disbelief. He looked once more at the beach below, a graveyard of men and machines moving and still. Smoke drifted in slow ribbons over the water. Somewhere an Allied flag had risen above the ruins. He lowered his eyes, knowing the Reich's promise of invincibility had died here. Carter sat beside a wrecked tank, his rifle still clutched, though the fight was over. The world had gone quiet except for waves and distant shouts. A chaplain walked slowly between bodies, whispering prayers that vanished in the wind. The sand beneath Carter's boots was black and warm, mixed with ash and blood. The invasion had succeeded, but victory, he thought, had never felt so hollow. The afternoon sun broke through at last, turning the smoke to gold. Ships still burned offshore, their reflections trembling in the tide. Engineers climbed the cliffs, clearing wire and mines with silent precision. The road to France had opened, but the road home was far longer. Carter watched them move like ghosts across the wreckage, their shadows stretching over a beach that would never forget them. As evening fell, war's fury gave way to silence. The sea, once red, turned glass beneath the fading light. Carter stared at the horizon, thinking of those who would never see it again. He closed his eyes, hearing only wind and distant gulls. In that moment, Normandy belonged to no nation, only to memory itself, carved in sand and blood, where courage and loss met beneath a dying sun. By afternoon, the roar of the sea had faded behind them, replaced by the slow crunch of boots through wet sand and scattered debris. Carter's unit moved inland through the smoking dunes, each step heavier than the last. The air was thick with sulfur and the copper sting of blood. Overhead, Allied planes droned like ghosts, tracing patterns of war across the clouds. He looked back once. The beach lay broken and distant, a scar of bodies and silence. Ahead, France waited in ruins. German resistance stiffened among the hedgerows beyond the coast. Rifle fire cracked through the mist, echoing like dry branches breaking. Müller, his arm bandaged and eyes hollow, crouched among scattered survivors. Officers barked orders no one heard. Men reloaded in silence, their faces ghostly in the drifting smoke. Pride, fear, and exhaustion blurred together until none could tell which still mattered. Somewhere behind them, artillery rumbled, grinding the last of their courage into dust. Carter's squad moved cautiously through a ruined farmhouse overlooking Vierville. Doors were kicked in, rifles raised, eyes darting to every shadow. A German soldier darted behind a wall. A burst from a Thompson ended his movement. The gunfire echoed through what once had been someone's kitchen. A family photograph hung by a single nail, its glass shattered by shockwaves. Dust drifted in golden light through the open rafters, settling gently over the debris of a world undone. Mortars began to fall again. Medics shouted for cover as one shell struck a jeep, hurling fire and steel across the road. Carter grabbed a wounded man, dragging him through mud behind a stone wall. The soldier's breath rattled. Blood steamed in the cool air. A medic dropped beside them, face pale beneath her helmet. "He'll make it," she whispered. though her trembling hands betrayed the lie. War reduced truth to whispers and hope to motion. In the forest above Colleville, Müller stumbled upon a knot of retreating Germans, boys no older than 16, faces streaked with grime and disbelief. Their sergeant barked orders none obeyed. "The line is gone," one muttered, staring at nothing. Müller slumped beside them, feeling his soaked bandage pulse with each heartbeat. The air trembled with distant artillery. The Reich's promise had shattered, leaving only boys hiding in the woods, pretending not to die. American armor crawled inland, treads grinding over rubble and corpses alike. German tanks fired in rhythm, their thunder shaking glass from shattered windows. Carter followed close behind, deafened by the symphony of metal. The road was lined with burned carts and the remains of horses. A French woman emerged from a cellar, clutching a barefoot child to her chest. The soldiers froze. For one strange second, the war paused, just long enough to remember what mercy looked like. A sniper's crack shattered the stillness. The woman screamed, ducking as bullets chipped stone around her. Soldiers returned fire toward a church steeple ahead. "Take that tower!" someone yelled. Carter dashed forward through smoke, heart hammering. White grenades burst across the street, blinding everything. The child's cries cut through the haze like a bell. In a world of explosions, that tiny voice was louder than any gun. 566 Chars. From a shattered attic window, Müller steadied his rifle across broken shutters. Below, Americans advanced through the narrow street, their helmets glinting in the smoke. His finger trembled on the trigger. A photograph of his fiancée hung beside the scope, corners burned. He exhaled slowly, lowering the rifle. Outside, the rumble of tanks filled the air. "Ich will nach Hause," he murmured. He wanted home, not victory, not orders, just to stop hearing the guns. Down below, Carter's squad stormed the last house near the church. The bell tower swayed above, roof torn open by shell fire. Inside, they found the sniper's perch, empty but still warm. The rifle lay smoking beside a half-eaten ration tin. Carter paused, scanning the small room. On the wall hung a photograph of a young woman, smiling faintly at a world she'd never see again. Dust floated through the broken ceiling like snow, silent and forgiving. Outside the village square was a graveyard of stone and echo. Civilians huddled in basements while medics carried the wounded on makeshift stretchers. A chaplain whispered last rites near a toppled fountain, his voice steady despite trembling lips. Carter stood motionless, rifle lowered, eyes hollow. The radio crackled with new orders. Push inland, secure the road. The beach had been hell, but this place felt like something worse, purgatory with no sky. Evening crept over the countryside. Müller limped through the hedgerows with 6 surviving soldiers, weapons dragging in the dirt. They passed burned trucks and horses stiff in their harnesses. One man carried his brother's helmet, saying nothing. The silence between them felt endless, broken only by distant thunder. Normandy no longer looked like France, it looked like an open wound, bleeding smoke and memory into the dusk. Carter's squad dug in behind a hedgerow as tracer rounds carved orange arcs through the twilight. The earth trembled beneath their boots. A runner appeared with supplies, cold rations, coffee black as oil. "We move again at dawn," the lieutenant said, voice flat from fatigue. Carter nodded, too tired to speak. Above them, fireflies drifted through gunsmoke, tiny ghosts of peace hovering where stars once shone. 578 Chars, a farmhouse ignited in the distance, its roof collapsing into flames that painted the clouds gold. Müller watched from the tree line, his face lit by fire and sorrow. He thought of his mother's kitchen in Bavaria, the smell of bread and pine. That world had vanished beneath rubble and radio static. Around him, wounded men muttered prayers in broken German. The sound was raw and human, a dying hymn for soldiers who no longer believed in victory. Near dawn, Carter awoke to the hiss of rain falling on steel. Drops steamed off helmets and cooled barrels still hot from the night's battle. The air smelled of mud and metal. He watched as water washed blood from the trenches, turning it into rust-colored rivulets. For a fleeting second, it felt cleansing. Then came the command to move. Boots sank into mud, the war marching forward one heartbeat at a time. A rumbling jeep pulled up carrying a field kitchen. A weary cook ladled steaming broth into tin cups, his hands shaking from exhaustion. Carter took one, steam fogging his glasses. For a moment, he tasted warmth instead of cordite. Then an explosion rocked the ground, knocking the cook into the mud. Soup splattered across both of them. They laughed once, too loud, too fast, and kept walking through the smoke and rain like men still pretending to live. Müller's group found refuge inside a ruined chapel. Light filtered through shattered stained glass, scattering shards of color across the cold floor. One soldier prayed aloud. Another wept quietly. Müller sat beneath a cracked statue of St. Michael, fingers clasped around a blood-stained cross. "Forgive us," he whispered, not sure to whom. Outside, the rumble of tanks rolled closer. Inside, the silence felt like judgment itself. Carter's platoon reached a crossroads littered with helmets, rifles, and spent shells. They dug shallow foxholes as dusk melted into night. A medic knelt nearby, checking pulses by candlelight. His face looked carved from wax, hollow with fatigue. Farther down the line, someone began humming a lullaby from home. The soft melody drifted through the trenches, absurdly gentle amid the ruin, proof that something human still breathed inside the smoke. Morning fog crawled over the fields like a living ghost. Müller woke to distant shouting and the grinding approach of tanks. He pressed his hand to his wound. It had reopened. A comrade tore a strip from his coat and tied it tight. "It's useless," Müller muttered. His voice cracked like the frost. For the first time, he didn't feel like a soldier or even a man of war. He felt like a shadow waiting for the world to end. Carter marched past a burned farmhouse where villagers scavenged for what little remained. A girl offered him a piece of bread, her small hands trembling. He nodded and smiled faintly, but words refused to come. Behind him, trucks rumbled toward the front, engines drowning the quiet. The girl watched as he disappeared into the mist, her reflection shivering in a puddle of rain, ash, and sky, an image of innocence staring at the machinery of war. As night fell once more, the guns fell silent for the first time in 2 days. Carter sat by a lantern, its flame flickering against his mud-streaked face. He wrote names into a small notebook, his handwriting uneven from exhaustion. Miles away, Müller watched the same moon through a shattered farmhouse window. Both men were alive, though neither felt it. Between them stretched the heart of Normandy, silent, haunted, and infinite beneath a cold, forgiving sky. July 2nd, 1944. The fields of Normandy glowed green beneath morning haze. Carter's platoon moved through narrow dirt lanes hemmed by thick hedgerows. Every shadow looked alive, every rustle a sniper's breath. The war had changed, no longer a storm, but a slow grind of nerves. Somewhere ahead, machine guns barked once, then fell silent. He raised his hand, signaling halt. The silence pressed like a hand around his throat, too heavy to breathe through. Across the ridge, Müller lay prone among tangled roots, his uniform soaked in dew and mud. His unit, what was left of it, had been ordered to delay the American advance at all costs. They had mines, rifles, and fear. He adjusted his sights on the gap between hedges, heart hammering faster than the gun's rhythm. He thought of home, of letters he'd never send, and for a moment his finger hesitated on the trigger. Then instinct won. The ambush hit like thunder. Carter's men scattered, ducking into ditches as bullets tore leaves into dust. The hedgerows, beautiful from afar, became walls of death.
"Flank right,"
he shouted, though no one could hear. A shell burst nearby, flinging soil across his face. He spat earth and blood, fumbling for his weapon. The world was a blur of sound and colorless motion, nothing but breath, sweat, and the terrible pulse of staying alive. Müller's rifle jammed. Cursing softly, he slammed it against the dirt and grabbed a fallen comrade's weapon. The air smelled of crushed grass and cordite. An American grenade arced over the hedge. He dove, hitting the ground hard as it exploded. Soil and shrapnel rained across his back. He heard himself scream but didn't feel pain, only ringing silence. When he looked up, the world was smoke and ruin, the hedgerow burning. When the shooting stopped, the morning felt unreal, quiet except for flies. Carter crawled toward the nearest hedge, careful of mines hidden beneath ferns. A medic's voice carried faintly through the smoke. "He's gone," someone whispered. Carter nodded, not asking who. Around him, the living and the dead shared the same stillness. The hedgerows had turned into graves, each one holding its breath for the next round of thunder. The Americans pushed deeper, inch by inch, through walls of green. Engineers carved paths with explosives, each blast echoing across miles. Müller regrouped with 3 soldiers in a hollow near a farmhouse, their faces pale as clay. They had no radio, no rations, only bullets. The sergeant muttered about reinforcements that would never come. In the distance, tank treads growled, a mechanical heartbeat closing in. Carter signaled his men forward under covering fire. The hedgerows parted into a small clearing dotted with bodies and abandoned helmets. Smoke curled from a wrecked half-track. Somewhere beyond, a single shot cracked. "Sniper!" someone yelled. Carter dropped, crawling into a trench lined with broken roots. He spotted movement, then a glint of glass. His rifle kicked once. Silence returned, thicker than before. Müller's ears rang from the bullet that grazed the hedge beside him. His squad had been reduced to 2 men and a boy. The boy sobbed quietly, clutching a rifle too big for his arms. "Keep low," Müller whispered. A mortar screamed overhead, tearing the air apart. Dirt fell like rain. When the smoke cleared, the boy was gone. Müller sat motionless, staring at the spot, whispering prayers to a god that had long stopped listening. Carter's platoon reached a crossroads littered with burned carts and livestock. The stench was unbearable. A tank burned in the distance, its gun drooping like a candle. "Keep moving," the lieutenant ordered, voice hoarse. They advanced past the wreckage, eyes darting to every window. A farmhouse door creaked. Inside, only silence and a piano missing half its keys. Carter touched one. The note rang flat and lonely, swallowed by the war. At sunset, Müller and his surviving comrade dug a shallow foxhole near the ruins of Saint-Lô. The horizon flickered orange, towns burning like dying stars. He shared his last canteen of water, his hands trembling. "Maybe tomorrow," the other soldier muttered. "Maybe," Müller replied, though neither believed it. The sky rumbled with artillery fire. In the glow, they looked like ghosts, 2 shapes caught between history and memory. Rain fell through the night. Carter lay under his poncho, watching drops streak across his helmet. Sleep wouldn't come. Every flash of lightning felt like a muzzle burst. In his pack lay letters from home, unread for weeks. He took one out, tracing the handwriting. "Be safe," it said. He smiled bitterly. The word had lost its meaning here in a land where safety belonged only to the dead. By morning, the rain had turned the fields into mud. Tanks bogged down, soldiers waded knee-deep through muck. Müller stumbled along a ditch, his boots sucking at the earth. His comrade coughed blood, leaning on him for support. They passed a wrecked ambulance marked with a red cross riddled with bullet holes. For a moment, Müller stopped. Even mercy had been shot through in this war. He turned away and kept walking. Carter's squad encountered a German prisoner, barely 18, trembling as he raised his hands. Mud streaked his face like paint. "He's just a kid," one man muttered. The lieutenant ordered him tied and moved along. As they marched, the boy's eyes stayed on Carter, wide and wet. Later that night, Carter couldn't forget that look, the kind that made you wonder who really won anything here. At midday, a column of American soldiers crossed a ruined bridge. Smoke curled from broken arches, the river below running red with silt and rust. A local farmer watched from the banks, hat in hand, his expression unreadable. Carter nodded to him, unsure if it meant comfort or apology. The farmer said nothing, only turned away as thunder rolled again. Müller woke beneath a collapsed tree, the ground trembling beneath distant bombardment. His comrade was gone. Only his rifle remained, half buried in dirt. He tried to stand, but the world spun. He crawled toward sunlight, emerging beside a dead horse stiff in its harness. The smell made him gag. Somewhere overhead, American planes droned, a sound that once meant death but now felt almost like mercy. Carter's platoon reached the outskirts of Saint-Lô, reduced to rubble and ash. Civilians wandered dazed through craters that had been homes. A woman clutched a photo frame against her chest. "No roof," she whispered in French. "No sky." Carter nodded, not knowing what to say. He handed her his canteen. The camera of war never lingered long on kindness, but it was there, in gestures no one would ever see. That night, Müller sat beside a crumbling wall, staring at his empty hands. He had lost his rifle, his men, and his name somewhere in the hedgerows. A single candle flickered beside him. He closed his eyes, remembering the sound of rain in Bavaria, the way it smelled of pine and bread. When he opened them, the candle had burned out, leaving only smoke and the faint light of dawn. Carter wrote in his journal by flashlight. The ink bled through damp pages. "The hedgerows are endless," he wrote. "Every field another ambush, every sunrise another grave." He paused, hearing frogs croak somewhere beyond the mud. For a second, it felt like peace. Then distant gunfire reminded him it wasn't. He closed the notebook, his handwriting trembling like the flame that lit it. By mid-July, the American advance had ground to a crawl. Fields turned to swamps, air choked with cordite and rot. Müller, now alone, wandered the ruins like a ghost. He found an abandoned helmet and placed it atop a cross made from 2 sticks. "Rue," he whispered. It meant rest, but nothing rested here. Only noise, only memory, only war itself breathing slow and steady. When the guns fell silent that evening, Carter sat beneath a shattered tree and stared at the sunset bleeding through the clouds. The light touched the ruins with something almost holy. He thought of the men they'd lost, the miles they'd gained, and how little any of it felt like triumph. "Tomorrow," someone said behind him. Carter nodded. Tomorrow meant more fighting, more names to write. He closed his eyes and listened as the crickets sang over the dead. August 1944. The skies above Normandy no longer thundered with invasion but burned with the quiet light of endings. Allied bombers traced black shadows across the clouds, their engines echoing like memory. Carter's platoon moved through fields of smoke and broken glass toward the ruins of Caen. Civilians lined the road, faces blank with exhaustion, clutching suitcases and photographs of what had been home. Somewhere a church bell rang, not for victory, but for those who had endured enough to still be standing. Müller awoke beneath, the weight of fallen timber, ears ringing with the ghost of artillery. The air tasted of ash and rust. He pushed himself free, dragging a wounded leg through the debris. Around him lay the remnants of his company, helmets split, rifles bent, postcards torn in half by shrapnel. He whispered the names of men he couldn't find, though none answered back. The war had moved on without him. What remained was not battle, but aftermath, the silence of those forgotten between fronts. By midday, Carter's platoon entered Caen through what was left of its western gate. The city smoldered, its stones still warm from the bombardment. A woman swept rubble from her doorstep, her hands bleeding but steady. From a cellar doorway, children peeked out, too thin, too quiet. Carter crouched, offering a chocolate bar. One boy took it, eyes wide, whispering, "Merci," as if afraid the word might vanish. That single sound carried more weight than the roar of 100 victories. North of the city, Müller limped through a field of charred wheat. The world looked drained of color, even in daylight. He reached a farmhouse that had collapsed into itself and found a cracked mirror lying in the mud. The face that stared back was older than the war, eyes sunken, soul emptied. He washed his face with rainwater from a tin, watching dirt swirl away. Somewhere in the distance, engines rumbled, a new army marching east. He wondered how many more would die before silence learned to last. Carter watched medics lifting wounded men from a truck, their stretchers trembling in the soldiers' shaking hands. The air reeked of iodine and cordite. A priest moved among them, touching foreheads, murmuring prayers that felt smaller than the suffering around them. "We're liberators," someone muttered beside him. Carter nodded slowly, though the word caught in his throat. Liberation didn't sound like cheering. It sounded like breathing again after drowning and realizing the water was still in your lungs. Müller followed the remnants of a railway line bending south. Smoke curled from overturned carriages, and telegraph wires drooped like the veins of a dying beast. In a nearby pasture, a cow lay still, its flank rising faintly with the last air inside it. He reached out, uncertain why, perhaps to prove something could still be touched gently. The sunlight that broke through the clouds painted everything in gold, too soft for such a place. He kept walking, afraid to stop, afraid of what silence might say. That night, Carter's platoon bivouacked by the Orne River, tarps stretched over wrecked jeeps. Rain fell steady, tapping helmets in rhythm with heartbeats. "Tomorrow we push east," someone said through the dark. "Tomorrow," Carter echoed, his voice dull, tired of tomorrows. He leaned back, staring at the shifting reflection of firelight on water. Every dawn brought the same question. Was survival proof of courage, or just another form of punishment for the living? Müller reached a nameless village reduced to stone and dust. He found a well still intact and lowered a bucket, the rope creaking like bone. The water smelled of rust but tasted clean. A woman appeared, barefoot, holding a baby wrapped in torn fabric. She looked at him but didn't flinch. He removed his helmet, nodding once. "Ich tue Ihnen nichts," he said softly. "I will not harm you." She gave a small nod, and for a moment, there was something sacred in their silence, a brief ceasefire written only in eyes. Carter entered the ruins of Caen Cathedral. Its ceiling had been torn open, letting sunlight pour through the wound like grace. Dust floated in slow spirals across the pews. A bird had built a nest atop the broken altar, chirping softly over shattered glass. Carter removed his helmet, fingers brushing the marble. For months, he had learned how to survive. In that moment, he remembered how to feel. Tears came quietly, not for the fallen, but for the part of himself he'd buried beside them. Müller followed the Orne until he found the remnants of a bridge blown apart by retreating troops. He could hear faint laughter from the opposite bank, American soldiers resting, music drifting from a gramophone. The melody was soft, warm, impossibly human. He sat on the stones, watching the river carry debris toward the sea. For the first time in years, the sound of an enemy didn't fill him with hate. It filled him with longing for a world where music survived men like him. The next morning, Carter helped engineers clear mines along the road to Falaise. Each step was deliberate, each breath too loud. They had survived the invasion, the hedgerows, the tanks, and now the ground itself threatened them. Funny thing, the lieutenant said, exhaling smoke, "We fight this hard just to keep walking." Carter gave a tired smile. He didn't answer. He just stepped forward 1 foot at a time because in war, standing still was the same as dying. Müller spent the day sheltering in an abandoned barn, its roof half gone, rain dripping through holes. The air smelled faintly of hay and decay. He tore the insignia from his sleeve, fingers trembling. The cloth fell into the mud like a confession. For years he had fought for something called Germany, a word that now meant hunger, ashes, and names carved on wooden crosses. Lightning flashed outside, illuminating his hollow face. When thunder followed, he whispered back as if answering an old god he no longer believed in. Carter's platoon entered Saint-Lambert that afternoon. Villagers flooded the streets, waving torn flags, tears streaking soot across their cheeks. Women threw flowers from shattered windows, and a soldier played a harmonica off-key. The sound was awkward, hopeful, human. Carter laughed for the first time in months, though it caught halfway to a sob. The people called them heroes. He wanted to tell them heroes didn't exist, only men who hadn't run out of breath yet. From the hills above the same village, Müller watched the celebration unfold. The cheers drifted up through the smoke, soft and ghost-like. He could see the flags, the embraces, the life returning to faces. From this distance, peace looked real. But in the valleys below, the wind still carried the smell of burned oil and blood. He pressed his palm against his chest, feeling his heartbeat slow. "It's over," he whispered to no one. Yet somehow the words refused to feel true. Night fell soft and blue. Carter sat by a small fire built from broken furniture, the flames licking at the wet wood. Around him, soldiers stared into the glow without speaking. "Home soon?" a private asked. Carter smiled faintly, his eyes distant. Home was no longer a place. It was a memory too fragile to touch. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded letter, edges frayed. He didn't open it. Some words were safer unread. Müller awoke to footsteps crunching wet straw outside the barn. His pulse quickened. He grabbed a piece of wood, heart hammering against his ribs. The door creaked open. Carter stood framed in the dim light, rifle lowered. For a moment, neither moved. Rain dripped through the roof, each drop a heartbeat between enemies. Carter's eyes softened. He nodded once. Müller dropped the wood, shoulders sagging. In that stillness, they understood the same truth. The war had finally run out of sound. Carter offered his canteen. Müller hesitated, then took it, gulping water like a prayer. Neither spoke, language unnecessary. They sat beneath the leaking roof, the rain easing to a mist. Outside, birds began to sing for the first time in weeks. Carter glanced at Müller's torn sleeve, Müller at Carter's mud-streaked dog tags. Two soldiers from opposite worlds bound by exhaustion and mercy. For a brief moment, history itself seemed to stop and breathe. When dawn broke, they parted without a word. Carter walked east toward his unit. Müller limped toward the trees. Each turned once, nodding silently across the field. Between them stretched a road lined with wreckage and wildflowers, life and death growing side by side. The war was ending, but its weight would not lift. They would carry its echoes like invisible scars, reminders not of glory, but of how much silence cost to earn. Weeks later, the radio crackled with news that Paris had been liberated. Carter sat on a jeep's hood, the wind tugging at his collar. Around him, men cheered and hugged, but his gaze stayed on the horizon where smoke still rose in the distance. Normandy had begun to bloom again, grass reclaiming trenches, poppies blooming in craters. The world was healing, yet part of him knew peace would never sound as loud as the war that made it necessary. Müller wandered south, thin as bone, until he found a meadow where wildflowers had begun to grow through rusted helmets. He knelt, tracing a petal with shaking fingers. The wind was warm for the first time that year. In the distance, a bell tolled, not sharp like before, but soft, forgiving. He looked up at the sky, eyes reflecting both grief and grace. Somewhere far away, the war truly ended, though the silence would always speak its name. The camera lingers, then fades. History exhales.